Good morning and welcome. I'm Marlisha Murtha Liddell, Vice Chair of the Parish Pastoral Council for St. Augustine Catholic Church in Washington, D.C., the mother church of Black Catholics in the nation's capital. Welcome to the first of a two-part virtual town hall series on racial injustice and inequity and the Catholic Church's response. This town hall was created in response to the outpouring of grief, anger, and frustration expressed by parishioners after the recent killings of George Floyd and other Black Americans that reopened old wounds and reignited a modern social justice movement to end systemic racism in the United States. As protests began sweeping the nation in early June, many were stunned and deeply hurt to watch the use of tear gas to clear peaceful protesters for a photo op in front of St. John's Episcopal Church, a place where for years dedicated St. Augustine parishioners gathered every other Friday night to minister to the homeless sleeping on those church steps. And when the shrine of St. John Paul II in DC was used the following day for a second photo op, many outraged parishioners were encouraged by Archbishop Wilton Gregory's public rebuke, finding it, quote, baffling and reprehensible that any Catholic facility would allow itself to be so egregiously misused and manipulated in a fashion that violates our religious principles, which call us to defend the rights of all people. But these and other events left many wondering, what is the church's role and responsibility to address racial injustice and inequity? Others asked, how can the church confront systemic racism in our country and society without first taking the beam of racism out of our own eye? These are some of the questions that lead us here today. Before I introduce our moderator, I'll quickly review a few housekeeping issues. In this webinar, all attendees are already muted with videos turned off. Great care was taken to review questions submitted with your registrations to address them during our discussion this morning. If you have questions that have not been answered, you may enter them into the Q&A section of your screen, and we will do our best to get to your question in our limited time this morning. This town hall is being live streamed on our parish's YouTube channel and will be recorded for later viewing. Please note, the chat function in Zoom has been disabled. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact the St. Augustine Multimedia Ministry at staugustindc.multimedia@gmail.com. I now would like to introduce our moderator, Yamiche Alcindor, who in turn will introduce our panelists. Yamiche Alcindor is the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC. She often tells stories about the intersection of race and politics. At PBS, she directly questions President Trump on his policies and has traveled extensively to cover major news stories, such as President Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, Finland. She also has traveled to McAllen, Texas, to chronicle life on the United States-Mexico border and the impact of President Trump's family separation policy. As a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, Alcindor often appears on a number of shows, including Morning Joe, Andrea Mitchell Reports, and Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. Previously, Ms. Alcindor worked as a national political reporter for the New York Times, where she covered Congress and the 2016 presidential elections. Before that, She was a national breaking news reporter for USA Today and covered the death of Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, and the police-related protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and in Baltimore, Maryland. Ms. Alcindor is a 2020 recipient of the White House Correspondents Association's Aldo Beckman Award for overall excellence in White House coverage. She earned her master's degree in broadcast news and documentary filmmaking at NYU and a bachelor's in English, government, and African American studies from Georgetown University. She is a native of Miami, Florida, and married to a fellow journalist, and is the proud daughter of Haitian immigrants who met while attending Boston College. With that, I would like to please welcome Yamiche Alcindor. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marlisha, for that introduction. I am so excited to be here. I'm a lifelong Catholic, and I've really been thinking and reflecting on these times. So this is a great conversation, I think, ahead as we all kind of think through our faith and our hopes for the future. So I want to now introduce the panelists for today. We have, of course, Father Patrick Smith. He is the pastor of St. Augustine Parish. That's been a role that he's been in for more than almost 3 decades, 29 years. Dr. Ansel Augustine, he's Executive Director of the Office of Cultural Diversity and Outreach in the Archdiocese of Washington. We have Dina Grant, formerly of the Library of Congress, St. Augustine parishioner and historian, and Dominic Molden. He's a senior fellow for community organizing and the democratic economy in the African and Latinx diaspora. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I want to first start by giving you each an opportunity to really talk about how you're feeling in this moment. Why is this subject so important? What do you want people to know? And what's on your mind as you're thinking? We'll start with Father Pat. And you got Father Pat, you have to unmute yourself. Don't you love these times?
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Again, thank you, Yamiche, for the introduction. I think probably like a lot of people, when I first saw the video of George Floyd's murder, I think it was a true Emmett Till moment, a moment where seeing something so horrific, and I think that where it's like, this is, it's just so horrible and so unjustified, et cetera. I think it was like a moment of saying this cannot continue going on. We have to do something, and but a sense of not just, it can't be something that we just forget about in a few months. So I think that it just reminded, as in the introduction, that opening, not just old wounds but fresh wounds. And so I think that, and we as a pastor, as a church, it's like that we are called to be light in the darkness. Someone said, if the world is filled with darkness, the problem is not the darkness. The problem is the light. Darkness means light's not shining. So the darkness is so clear, but the light needs to shine like ever before. And I think that's what really why I'm here today.
As you see it, think of an Emmett Till moment. That's why I became a journalist at civil rights reporting, and we're here again. Dina, I want to turn to you. Tell me a little bit about what you're thinking about in this moment and why being here was so important. And Dina, also you have to unmute yourself.
Not the only one.
You, maybe all the panelists can unmute themselves now so that when I come to you, everybody will be unmuted. Go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the moderator. I want to thank all of us who are together in this moment of time. Though it's challenged, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to come out better on the other side. And my heart has been heavy this morning. I want to thank the great cloud of witnesses who surround us, a wonderful group of people who founded this parish several decades ago that have brought us to this moment in time as well. So it's with a heavy heart, but it's with a heart of joy as well.
Thinking about our ancestors, thinking about the fact that you're thanking them is so powerful, and it's so needed in this moment, as I think about, and we all think about, kind of the gift that is St. Augustine. I want to now turn to Ansel. What are your thoughts?
Well, I echo what Father Pat and Dina said. This is a moment for us to step up and step out on faith. This is where we put our faith into action. I just moved here to the DC area 4 months ago when the quarantine went into effect, originally from my hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana. And the reason I'm here is this is what ministry is supposed to be, is being out in the streets, creating change. And as Jesus did himself, being a voice for the voiceless and sometimes empowering the voiceless to speak, not only for themselves, but sometimes for the church in and of itself, because that is where, as Pope Francis says, for us to go to the peripheries, because in those spaces, we're not there to save, but those spaces may save us. And we see it happening now in all of our places, in all of our spaces, especially with the leadership of our youth and our young adults. As someone that's done youth ministry for most of my ministry, I am empowered. I'm tired, but I'm also empowered by what I see with our young people. And that's why I'm here right now.
Dominic, what are you thinking about? What's on your mind in these moments?
Well, first of all, let me thank all the folks at St. Augustine's, where I started my organizing journey on June the 1st, 1986. And I'm going to organize the rest of my life. So thank you for that gift and that opportunity. And because I'm an organizer, what I'm thinking about in this moment is the situational analysis we need to take into consideration in this moment. And that analysis tell me a couple of things. First is that there was a crisis before the pandemic in Black America and in the African American communities, in a nation where we spend $732 billion on the military, in a city, DC, where we spend $600 million on the police department, in Baltimore, where all my relatives live, where they spend $550 million on the police department. What we realize is that our basic needs cannot be met around healthcare, education, and employment, because we live in a violent nation that is essentially a racialized police state. So understanding that situation, the Sandra Bland's, the Breonna Taylors, the Tamir Rice, and finally George Floyd's situation shows us that we live in a violent police state based on the 400 years of oppression of African people. And we said, like the Zapatistas said in Mexico, when they rise up, ya basta, we have had enough. So today, we want to take all our spirits and say, what can we do together to bring about a racially just society in America? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dominic. I want to now jump right into questions. The first is, what has the role, and I think I'm going to go to Dina on this, what has been the role of the Catholic Church in the fight against racism and inequality post-civil rights movement? Talk a little bit about the history of the church's role, the messaging as our kind of resident historian.
Oh, you're talking about the Catholic Church universally? Yes. Well, it's been an ongoing struggle since, I guess, we became Catholic. You know, at St. Augustine, we formed the Black Catholic Congress movement to address issues in the Catholic Church in 1889. And we have been pressing forward to have a seat at the table for the bishops, for the clergy, for the Rome to hear our needs and to press on.
And with that, Father Pat, I want to come to you, having listened to you preach the gospel. I understand just how much you kind of really actively get people involved in thinking about their role in playing social justice. So I want to ask you, what responsibility do you think people of faith have to actively work against racism? And talk a little bit also about the history of the Catholic Church and how St. Augustine fits into that.
I think, I always remember, I think it was Martin Luther King, I think part of the Birmingham jail letter, about referring to the church as saying how an early church was more of a thermostat for society, but today it looks more like a thermometer. Thermostat, if you think of it, it sets a standard and challenges the environment around it to come up to the standard. And thermometer just reflects what's already there. It just tells you this is what it is. So instead of being a standard bearer, too often it was just a standard mirror. Where just a mirror just shows you what is. So you have Jim Crow practices out in society, and you got Jim Crow practices in the church. You couldn't have a seat at the lunch counter. You couldn't have a seat in the front of the church. So I think that. But I would say that the church has always been. I mean, it proclaims from the time founded by Christ, proclaimed call to share a gospel that it has to live up to itself. So the first, the message got to come to itself to be converted itself. And I think so. It's an ongoing journey. I think we've seen where first when we talk about the church universal. I mean, the church, it didn't start in the United States. It didn't start in Europe. You can go right all the way back to the scriptures. And see the Ethiopian eunuch in the Acts of the Apostles. And so the story our story goes all the way back to the beginning with the church. And but I think that uniquely, especially, and I would say also, the church is by nature missionary. Okay, and I think that in part of back at the turn of the century, the 20th century, I forget the particular pope who made a point of saying, for example, missionary work, the goal is to raise up indigenous leaders. Now that was what the Universal Church was saying from the Vatican. In the United States, there was absolutely no interest in it, especially after 1865. There was a concerted effort not to evangelize any of those 2 million former slaves. So again, so on one hand, you had the Universal Church and Vatican saying one thing, but the Church of the United States, like every different territory, says, but this is how we're going to apply it or not apply it. The other thing, so I think that, and part of that, I think that, I think as far as for the church, so we said continuing to grow, as you mentioned here, even at St. Augustine, Dean had mentioned how in 1889, the first colored Catholic Congress, they called it, which wasn't just for Black Catholics, it was a national Congress. And so there was a prime focus on Black Catholics, but looking at the plight of Black Americans. So I think that's one example of where you see the individual community of with Black Catholics at the time were really being a start leading a way of saying, this is what the church is supposed to be doing. It wasn't just what Black Catholics supposed to be doing. So it was like, so let us be a voice, as Dr. Ansel mentioned, being a voice for the voiceless. In this case, so I think that what we're proud of St. Augustine, that we have a, when you tell the story, the history of, let's say, of the Church of the United States, not just the Black Catholics, but the Church of the United States, you will intersect several different times with the history of St. Augustine. And so, today the question is, we have the great responsibility of continuing to carry that legacy on, of being a voice, even of a truth to power. We had organizations, the St. Augustine, the Federated Colored Catholics, back, I think started in 1929, that was specifically about continuing making a voice, speaking to not just the bishops, but also to the Vatican, really calling out, things like, Catholic University, which is a pontifical university, means under the Pope, and letting the Pope know, are you aware that your university at DC doesn't allow Blacks? So there were many times where even folks here at St. Augustine and here, the local church was appealing to the Universal Church to continue to challenge and call the bishops to live up to the calling they received.
The rich history, and I want to go to you, Dr. Ansel, about what you think the role people should be playing, Catholics should be playing, to actively work on ending racism and structural and institutional racism. Well,
it comes back to our baptismal call. When we're baptized as priest, king, and prophet. And, and the late Congressman, God rest his soul, John Lewis said, we are called to get into good trouble. That's what we are called to do, is to go out into the world and make those changes and challenge the system to be better. And the model for that, for me and for my inspiration, I studied and I teach at Xavier University of Louisiana, the only Catholic HBCU in the country and the only Catholic university in the Western Hemisphere founded by a saint, Saint Catherine Drexel, for us to be able to study, because of, as Father Pat mentioned, the reality of Jim Crow and segregation, we weren't allowed to go to the other Catholic universities. But one of the statements we use is the statement of the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus in 1968, when they said this to their brother bishops: the Catholic Church in the United States, primarily a white racist institution, has addressed itself primarily to white society. But contrary, we feel that primarily that it should not exclude that, but should be working toward the eradication of any social injustice. So for us, that is our role. Real quick story of how this works out. Post Katrina, after we rebuilt my home church, which is behind me, St. Peter Claver in New Orleans, I started working for the Archdiocese of New Orleans. And one of the roles that my role in youth ministry was to help diversify the outreach of the Archdiocesan youth ministry programs, because very few of our Black Catholic churches were participating or felt comfortable participating. And many of the parents said the only way they would send their children to these events, especially these meetings of the leadership board known as Teen Cross, was if the Black Catholic students came with Mr. Ansel. That's what they referred to me as then. And so I will pick up our Black Catholic high school students from the high schools and bring them to this meeting. One meeting in particular, we had to go early to help set up. And at this time, because of Katrina, many of our New Orleans based churches known as, y'all say counties everywhere else, we say parishes in Louisiana, in Orleans Parish were flooded and still rebuilding. So we would meet out in Jefferson Parish in the suburbs. And this one church in particular where we met, we would gather to meet it for Teen Cross. So this one week I was asked to go early because the volunteer couldn't come early from get off work to set up. So I picked up the young men from St. Augustine High School, which is the all Black Catholic male high school in New Orleans. And I will pick them up and we came early to set up. I came in to put the key in the door to unlock the hall to set up. And immediately a white woman came from around the corner. This was her church, I'm assuming, and was immediately grilling us, asking who we were, why we were there. Mind you, these young men were in Catholic uniform. I was in Archdiocesan, wearing an Archdiocesan polo. And she was grilling us. And I was being respectful as possible because these young men were witnessing this. And immediately she threatened to call the police. And it was at that moment, because there is a history of unfriendly interactions with Black males, and about 2 minutes later, Jen showed supposed to volunteer, white male, to help set up. And he said this, he said, what's the problem here? And she only asked him, are they with you? And he said, yes. And she turned around and walked away. He didn't know who she was. She didn't know who he was. It was just the fact that they were both white people and they belonged, did not. And what has been going on up to this point, when we look at the history of our church, we have to remind our institution, there's a lot of great documents out there, but put into action that and remind them we belong here. My mentor in ministry, Father Cyprian Davis, who wrote the book, The History of Black Catholics in the United States, class, that behind the Israelites, people of African descent are mentioned in the Bible second only, like I said, to the people of Israelite descendants. And so for us, we have to remember, this is our faith, as Father Pat said. We belong here, especially when we look at the church founding here in this country. We've been here, this is our space, and it is our right to worship the way we can and to make sure justice reigns for all.
Dr. Ansel, you touched on something that's so critically important, and that is, of course, racism in the church. Mm-hmm. Father Pat, you talked about it too. This is to anyone, but I want to talk about, how does the church deal with racism, including erasing faces of color, including Jesus's. I remember the first time I went to St. Augustine as a college student going to Georgetown, I wrote a paper about it for a class, and I said that it looked like I was flipping through a family photo album, because I had never been in a Catholic church. Even though I was a lifelong Catholic, I had never been in a Catholic church where the images on the stained glasses looked like me. And that image stuck with me for the rest of my life. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about racism in the church. And I could direct it to anyone. I want to direct it to Father Pat, but I can let anyone else jump in.
I can start. I think first, I think maybe just, we use the term racism. I think it's, you know, what we hear a lot in the news today is systemic racism. And I think that's really important. Like I had a conversation with one of the planners for today, and they made a comment after we talked about George Floyd, and they said, well, you know, just what is it makes people do these horrible things? And they, you know, is it, you know, they're, you know, would they have different issues? Is it fear? Is it, you know, and it's like, I said, you know, we make an important distinction between, you know, there are lots of reasons people may be bigoted. People are cruel. People are unjust. People are afraid, prejudiced, but that's different than systemic. So I may say, maybe you have issues and your issues is the issue. Systemic, it means exactly what the word says. There's a system. What that really means is, well, this is not just individual issues. So you can't, for example, point to a bad apple and say the bad apple is the problem. Let's remove the apple and everything, then we have a good fruit basket. No, in fact, as you discover that, wow, there's lots, no matter how many apples we remove, there's something, there's something in with flawed in the design. Or even that, you say systemic or institutional, you're literally saying that someone thought about this. I mean, someone really took time to put this together, you know, to work it as a system, an institution. That takes planning, that takes strategy, that takes intent. What is your goal? What's your phase 1, phase 2, whatever? So you look at, you know, how do you form the institution of slavery? You know, a major, you know, economic, you know, a business. You know, when you look at Jim Crow, when you look at the time of Reconstruction of 12 years after slavery, and suddenly that's all wiped away. You know, how did that happen? I'll tell you how it happened, not by accident. You know, so part of when we talk about institutional or systemic, it's like where there has been you know, this has been planned, this has been thought out, and it's a part of the system institution itself. And if you're blind to, if you don't see that, then you literally can be in the institution and unaware of what's really going on either in black or white. So I think that it's really important that we see that, because that's the only way we can then look at ourselves as a church and see, so how is the institution of the church complicit, and how can we be the solution? Because it's not a matter of intent. One of the most common things, if you ever mention race, the R word, the defensiveness is, hey, I'm not a racist. You know, what is something called, we know for those in law, you know, something called a disparate impact. You know, you can have no racist intent, come up with a policy. It just so happens to discriminate against Hispanics only, but you may say I didn't intend it, but the fact is, you know, you can be sued, let's say for discriminating, not because you had racist intent, it's because your policy actually discriminated. And that's why it's probably even more healthy to, like, we can talk racism as an umbrella, but I think, you know, racial injustice. When you say injustice, you think, okay, you can point to something. What are we actually talking about? And so I think that, you know, when you look at, so part of the thing is critically important. I think that we, you know, it's one form of institutional systemic racism that every one of us have been affected if we grew up in this country and took American history, is precisely the propaganda of American history, meaning where every single one of us got a heavily redacted version of American history. You know, we didn't know, so, you know, I didn't learn in any of my schooling. I went to Catholic school from first grade through college, you know, never learned about Reconstruction. And why is that important? Because if you know that, you know, what Henry Louis Gates referred to Reconstruction at 12 years after slavery, you know, as the most significant period in the history of American race relations. You know, the great period of a great period of freedom for Blacks, where Blacks served, you know, were members of Congress and were judges and law enforcement and juries and local legislation. It's like, you know, discovering that was like, is this real? I mean, there was a time, and the thing is, that period, the reason we suppressed that story is precisely because that it totally refutes the party line, Black criminality, Black ignorance. It's like, because it's like, wait a minute, they were legislators and helped build schools for not only themselves, but poor whites. You know, so part of it, I'd say just the ignorance of history. We have to know that the cries of today came from somewhere. And they aren't just, certain individual bad things that happen today. There's a reason that there is an antagonistic relationship between Black people and police. There's a historical reason, okay? When you look at the complicity of, how did you keep the free enterprise of slavery? Once emancipation said no more slavery, 13th Amendment, it's like, well, that whole industry was based on free labor. And so you see a complicity between police, the courts, and big business conspire together to make sure they continue that free labor. Okay, by basically, and so you can literally go back to the courthouses today, because they weren't ashamed of it. You can go to courthouses today and look in the court records back in the 1800s, where you see mass arrests of Black people after slavery, and all of them for misdemeanors. And you'd also notice that many of these mass arrests happen at planting season and harvest time. Because of that, again, the caveat in the 13th Amendment, you cannot forcibly put people into labor, except if they are guilty of a crime. And so that was the caveat, said, well, we will use that. So literally a mass arrest of people in order to get to free labor. So I'm saying is, so the history goes back, and I said, so there has been this antagonistic history. Police and the experience for Blacks, it wasn't protect and serve. It was to entrap and criminalize and move into forced labor. So part of it is that, so I think one place of beginning of being about recognizing the systemic reality of racism in our own church is, first of all, recognizing we have acknowledged how it exists in society, and every member of the church is also a member of that same society.
And Dominic, I want to turn to you to talk about a bit about what Father Pat was talking about. And the parishioner had a similar question to me in thinking about this. It's about the images of the church also, the denial of history, the idea that when people go to other Catholic churches, they don't see people in the Bible that look like them when they're on stained glass windows. How does the church reconcile that? Is there a reckoning of the history of the images and the people who represent the church?
Yes. I actually want to take a global view in answering this question, because I think the global view will help the local view. So I think one of the sins of racism that we have to confront, which will make people uncomfortable, and that is the colonization of the Americas and the West Indies and Africa. So when you think about that colonization, you have to remember that what was going on is that the whole concept of the Imago Dei, that God and the Spirit is made in your image and likeness, it didn't apply to people that were Black, right? That wasn't the image when we were being colonized that they were promoting. You got the white Jesus and the white Mary. And so the way we reconcile that is not only deal with the actual history of the early and ancient church, but also deal with the process of colonization. And like Father Pat said, when we talk about this, we're not trying to blame individual teachers or individual churches. What we're trying to do is hold accountable and responsible the institutions, which is the church and the universities and the schools that propagated this lie. And so in dealing with that lie, we have to come to a point of healing and reconciliation, that there was an anti-Black culture that was universal in the church that done psychological and actually in some cases physical damages to Black people globally, that applies to the damage that was done at Georgetown University when they sold enslaved Africans to keep the university going, that was done when Georgetown University discriminated against Black and brown bodies in the neighborhood, and also with Georgetown being a Black community that was entirely displaced into an elite and an affluent white community. So once again, church and society goes together, and until we reconcile that and create a historical pedagogy to address that, we're not getting to the root issues that we're trying to address today.
Oh, I wanted to add something. You were talking about when you came to St. Augustine and you saw probably the St. Augustine and Monica window. You know, when we finally moved out from the basement of St. Matthew's, which was then church in 1866, our chapel was dedicated to who was then Blessed Martin de Porres, who was a Peruvian African brother at the time. And if you come into the church and you look where he's standing there, he has followed us up 15th Street since 1866. And then when we became a full church in 1876, we're named after St. Augustine, who comes from North Africa. And in Old St. Augustine, they also had a statue to St. Cyprian, who is another saint of African descent. So even within this, we have known who we are and had promoted that. And we had a big parish celebration in 1962 when Martin de Porres became a saint. So even in the context, we have known about the history of the church and celebrated it. It's like I said, you come into church Sunday or whenever you can come back, and Martin de Porres is still there since 1866. He was, we've dedicated our chapel to him, chapel and school to him.
Yeah, I mean,
Dina, I was gonna, oh, go ahead.
But you can follow Dina.
You sure, Father Pat?
Sure, okay.
You can jump in real quick.
Okay, one of the things, just, I mentioned the church is a missionary church, called to, Jesus said, command the apostles, go to every nation, baptize them in Father, Son, Holy Spirit, teach them what I commanded, and I'll be with you. But we can see periods in history where clearly the church confused evangelization with colonization. They mixed them up. It's like, so you literally see things where, let's say, missionaries from Europe will go to Africa, and eventually they build churches, and they'd have stained glass windows, and they'd be European saints. They would be, the churches would look like European buildings. And that was where there's confusion of, like, even with good intent, that's not evangelization. Evangelization would bring out the very best in every culture. It highlights the best in every culture and raises it higher. And it also points out what's bad in any culture, and calls you to go grow from it. So, and that's why, and I think we can see where, it's, you're not going to see a church, I don't think, a church built today, like you do, if you go to like a St. Charles Owanga church, and that it's, it looks like a giant hut, it looks like, and the images, so there's more recognition of that, but I think recognizing that, colonization distorts the gospel. Mm-hmm. The good news is not European culture. The good news is Jesus Christ and his gospel. And also in the message of incarnation, meaning Jesus became one of us. So that's why, for example, we talk about images. It is perfectly appropriate. I mean, if I go to China, if there's a Catholic church in China and they have a nativity scene at Christmas, and those figures look Chinese, that does not bother me. They're saying he looks like us. Mm-hmm. He represents us. And the tragedy is that somehow when it comes to Black, it's been like, no, he can't look like that. Mm. And that is the sin, that's the lie. That in the fact is, Jesus said, what you did to them, you did to me. He does identify with us. And he identifies with others. But I don't have a problem with, people want to, but the issue becomes when somehow the image of Black is seen so repulsive and anti-holy, opposite of holiness, that we cannot depict images of saints or biblical figures with dark skin or saints. Or the saints.
I want to, I guess, ask you a really quick follow-up question because I was going to go to Dina, but it's a good segue into a question that I had for you, Father Pat, about the role that the Christianity and the church has played in colonization. There are some people that when I tell them I'm Catholic, they in some ways step back and say, how can you reconcile the fact that you're Catholic when you know that it came through colonization? What do you say to people who are troubled by that idea? I'm Haitian. I know why I'm Catholic. I'm Catholic because, one, of course, I believe in the faith and I was raised in a Catholic home, but also because I'm Haitian and we were colonized by the French who brought Catholicism along with slavery to the shores of Haiti until we were, of course, freed in 1904 or 1804, rather, as the first Black nation. But even with that rich history of being the first independent Black nation in the Western Hemisphere, with enslaved people taking back the country and saying, no, we're going to be free. there's still this idea that the religion stayed, and the religion is what was passed on to me and what I might pass on to my children.
Yeah, I think one of the things, you know, part of the profound witness of really people of color, you know, who were colonized, evangelized, is the fact that we've been able to distinguish between the authentic faith of the gospel, you know, and the messengers who brought it. Okay, our devotion is not to the messengers, it's to the message, and the messengers should know that. Okay, and that's what, so again, so part of us growing as into people of faith from, you know, maybe the century earlier when the messengers brought it with all their flaws and brought not only the gospel but also the distorted views of the culture and of their biases. The things that we grow further, we act, and the more we're able to, when we know the story, we know the gospel, we know history, we can, you know, chip off those things that we're not of, you know, we don't have to have, you know, only images that look like somebody else. You know, we don't, you know, so I think that, and we see that even at St. Augustine. I mean, you know, when the church, you know, when St. Augustine built the church for the first time, you know, I mean, you had, you know, folks from Italy and from architects and designers, and because we were Catholic, you know, and we're proud to be Catholic, you know, but at the same time, you know, we see how we've evolved as far as never, you know, still true to our Catholic faith, but actually maybe a little more true. The fact that we're expressing it in a way that is, I don't have to deny my identity, my culture, my heritage, to celebrate the same faith that anybody else celebrates in the other part of the country. So I think that part of growing, whether it be Haitian or African Americans, it's like that, making a distinction. And I think the only reason you have Black Catholics in the United States is because we clearly made a distinction between, you know, the message of the gospel, you know, our Catholic faith, the Eucharist, you know, that. And so, I mean, if we, like, how many of you, you know, the idea of sitting in the back of church, being forced to sit in the back of the church, but sitting there anyway. So I could receive Christ in Eucharist. You know, I could, you know, and I think what I often tell people when people say, maybe this is more the broader question, you know, as a Black, you know, why with the history of racism, the history of discrimination and Jim Crowism even within the walls of our church, you know, how can you, you know, why don't you stay with, why don't you leave the church? You know, and my answer really is like, you know, the church is Christ's bride, right? I mean, the image of Jesus, the bridegroom, says, you know, and I stay because he's still there. You know, when Jesus divorces his bride, I will too, you know, and you know what? He's not gonna do that, you know, because he came for sinners, okay? You know, like them, like me. And so I think that, so what ultimately we're all called to is something called ongoing conversion, you know, and the church itself, entrusted with the mission, also must be a part of that ongoing conversion. You know, we cannot just give people the medicine because we got sickness too. We get to take it ourselves and give it to others.
And Dina, now I want to do my follow-up question to you, which is the history of St. Augustine. How does that relate to the Black Lives Matter movement that we're seeing today? And if you could talk a little bit about how Black Catholic communities across the country and across the nation have contributed to the fight against racial injustices. But start first with how our history, the history of the church, dovetails with the movement we're seeing today.
I think, and I hope Faustina is on here. When Faustina and I were talking last week, she said the founding of St. Augustine in and of itself was an act of protest. And it really was, you know, because I was thinking about our conversation earlier about, so, you know, why are you Black and Catholic? St. Augustine and the parishioners, and I've like traced them through city records, were surrounded by Black churches, Metropolitan AME, 15th Street Presbyterian Church, Asbury United Methodist Church. Those are Black congregations. So clearly they could have gone to any of those other churches. So we came together. Most of these people came from Southern Maryland, PG County, over Northern Virginia. And the records say when they came, we wasn't missionary. When they came and started gathering in St. Matthew's, they knew the faith. And as a community, they wanted to worship as Catholic. They wanted to have, to educate their children. They took care of each other with a burial society. They took care of the poor of the city. They educated people directly after the Civil War, provided housing with the contraband, I hate that word, who were coming to the city. So I think as a church, we are an act of protest, and we continue to be an active protest.
And with that in mind, how do you think parishioners should be thinking through how to address racial injustice as you think about the church as a protest, Dina?
Oh, because we've always been on the forefront. Like I said, we've spoken out with the founding of the Black Catholic Congress movement to address issues in the church. We have with the Federated Colored Catholics in 1825, and just how we have tried to sustain ourselves in the neighborhood that has surrounded us with economic development. Dominic Molden did a lot of work when he was a much younger man, training people in the neighborhood how to buy property, how to maintain some of the buildings that are there. We continually educate our children every day, 9 months out of the year, and throughout that. So we are continually giving back to the world. We are bread to the world.
And Dr. Ansel, I want to come to you to talk about kind of how the church deals with legislation. As someone who's a reporter, I cover both parties, but I'm interested in knowing, can the church play a role? Should the church be playing a role in effective change through legislation? And if so, how?
Yes. Well, of course, the church needs to be that conscious, when it's in its ideal state, doing its ideal work, we're helping make the world a better place. So the church, although not church and state are separate according to the terminology, we still have our role to make sure that unjust views and unjust laws are just. And so we do have plenty of Catholic legislatures out there doing that kind of work, but we as church leadership need to help keep them properly informed on how best to serve those. And of course, as I've said this before, our role is not necessarily to uphold the status quo, but to make sure those that are most vulnerable, whether it's by birth, whether it's by socioeconomic class, whether it's by race, gender, or whatever, are taken care of. And to be, as we said before, being that voice for the voiceless and upholding those that are needing the most.
I want to stick with you, Dr. Ansel, and say, what can the faithful do to support church leaders in their efforts? And how, and I will say this as kind of an added to that, Father Pat, he's always been someone that I've looked at and said, like, that is a brother, if I can say that, who really is igniting and motivating people like me. Every time I listen to him, I think this is a church leader that I can get behind, someone that I just know has the best intentions in mind. That said, not all church leaders obviously are Father Pat. So I also want to know, how do you support church leaders in fighting racial justice, but how also do you hold some accountable that aren't practicing what the gospel preaches, which is, of course, treating people equally and good and loving your neighbor?
Amen. Well, we have this concept in our church known as original sin. And original sin created all the negative stuff that we deal with now, the sin that's in our world right now. Well, the USCCB has listed racism as America's original sin. So all the effects of whether it's slavery, segregation, and even just the constant battles we deal with today are a result of that original sin of what America unfortunately has put, as we said, in personal effects, but also in its institutions. And so we have, quote unquote, those labeled as good troublemakers, such as the people of inspiration, as you said, like Father Pat. I've heard him speak several times, and those that have been in the community representing our faith traditions, doing the right thing. And so how do you support? Well, let them know you're there. Many times, those of us that have spoken out against racism sometimes feel like we are alone, because sometimes we're feeling like we're out there fighting this quote unquote good fight by ourselves. And even when we look at our Black Catholic tradition, Sister Thea Bowman, who's one of the 6 on the road to canonization from the African-American community, addressed the USCCB. And she said this: we need to look at our Black Catholic heritage as a gift to the church, and that's what good troublemakers such as Father Pat and several other people have done. Several of us have been advocating for our youth and young adults from our Black Catholic community, but sometimes we get beat up. So how do you support? Pick up the phone, check on them, send an email letting them know you're there, but also holding accountable. When you see something wrong, say something, do something, not just saying, well, that's just the way it is. Because if we continue to be that way, we wouldn't have gotten as far as we've gotten to this point, even though there's plenty of more work to do. And that's what we're seeing out there with, like I said before, these youth and young adults leading these and organizing these movements and marches and protests, they're doing what our ancestors did and our elders did in the civil rights struggle. It's coming up again. And so how do we support? We support them, help them, give them voices to share their testimony and their movement, while also connecting them to the elders and wisdom holders of our community. Not to call you an elder, Father Pat, I'm not calling you old, but to share and make those connections there so they see that what they're doing right now is they're living out their faith by taking action in the community.
And Dominic, I saw you shaking your head when Dr. Ansel was talking about feeling alone when you're fighting racism. Talk to me a little bit about whether or not any of the things that he just said resonates with you.
Yeah, I think it resonates with me because what Dr. Augustine is talking about, that I want to make more specific, is that one of the gifts that we bring to our communities in the church is leadership. Mm-hmm. But that leadership is something that's always challenged, and I'm going to frame it this way intentionally. I think it's lonely when you exercise Black power as Black people. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that we need to focus on and challenge all our leadership about, especially the hierarchical leadership in the church, is how comfortable are they nurturing Black leadership and having us exercise Black power. And like Dina said, I learned a lot of that in the 1980s and the 1990s at St. Augustine from Miss Pauline Jones, one of the mothers of the church, and then Lois E. York, who was the extension of the church in the community doing the work of the 14th and U Street Coalition. Because one of the big fights that the pandemic is bringing up is this whole issue around housing and land. And St. Augustine, through the 14th and U Street Coalition, was one of the first groups in DC that focused on anti-displacement organizing so that Black people can stay in our communities. And as you can see, over the last 20 years, 40,000 Black folks have been displaced from DC. But if we had more power, we could stop that. And so I think one of the challenges I'm presenting today is that a lot of folks want to come back and a lot of folks want to stay today. So this whole pandemic has led to this whole cancel the rent movement that's going on in the country. So what I'm saying is St. Augustine had a history of dealing with housing issues the same way Ernest Withers and Jim Henderson were leaders at St. Augustine in the Free South Africa movement, right? So once again, that's clear organizing around Black power, around Black issues from church leadership. And so we don't need to go back that far to recognize the fact that there were people stepping out there. And like Dr. Augustine said, we have to support those people. And I think this webinar is like the call for more people to step forward. And we want to support those people and have a plan, because we want to take this opportunity, because in this moment, there's an opportunity for change, and people shouldn't feel that they're alone out there, that we will support you, because we're trying to fight the anti-Blackness in the world and the anti-Blackness in our own communities.
I'm about to transition to the Q&A portion of this, but I have one last question that I came up with. Maybe I'll put a couple more in during the Q&A, but I want to ask you, Father Pat, a question that I had when I started thinking about this. Everyone has their boxes that they're working in. If you're either a journalist, you're not supposed to be giving your opinion. For me, I'm someone who covers Republicans and Democrats, who covers the president. I'm someone who can talk, obviously, about not having racism pulsing through America and the evils of that. But in terms of the box that I'm living in, it's still a box of journalism. Other people have a box of being a doctor. You, of course, are a priest. I want to know how much of a box you feel yourself in, because you obviously are connected with the Vatican. How much of what you're doing do you feel like has to be okayed by the Vatican, or do you feel any pressure from the Catholic Church to kind of toe any kind of line as you think through the next few years and next few months, thinking about racism and pushing back on racism?
Well, I'll start with where I guess Dr. Ansel mentioned and Dominic followed. Just when you talk about the loneliness of being you know, of being a voice to the, not just speaking truth to power, you know, being a voice that it is, and there's always a feeling of risk, and it's always, but I think that, you know, we just, you know, we followed the, you know, the life and the burial of John Lewis. It's like, that comes with the territory. If you're going to be a leader, yeah, you might get your head knocked in, you might, and I think that, but also you might, people, race is such a volatile issue. Sometimes just to say the word is to make people shiver in their boots, you know, and it's like, so, but the reality is that, you know, there's no leader of the church that is, I can point to and say, that's why I'm a priest. Not one. I'm not a priest. I'm not a priest because of my parents. I was called. I heard the call and I said yes to the call. I could have said no, but I knew I'd have no peace if I said no. And that's still true today. So calls with them, many times it's like, okay, there's circumstances changed. It was, you know, everything was all set up for our school to close in 2008. And I felt, you know, I knew 2008 was the 150th anniversary of St. Augustine Church. So that's called a jubilee, a major jubilee, a time of God's favor and blessing. That says, how does God want us to celebrate that jubilee? Closing the school? That makes no sense to me at all. So the conviction was, God put on our heart that we have to mobilize and do whatever we have to do, and we did. So I didn't. So, and just so you know, I'm not so much working constantly of the Vatican. It's more of your own diocese. And so I think that so sometimes, but there's freedom. There's no, you know, I wasn't forbidden to try to keep the school open, but I knew that we would have to pay for it ourselves. So I think that, and we could do that for our school, but we couldn't do it for the other dozen schools that have closed. So I think that, it's really, far as me trying to be true to what God is calling me to do, and ultimately that's what I have to please. I want to please, and that's what the answer is to. So I don't feel like I can't do that. But there's a price you pay, and there's you know, have no control of people's perception, and sometimes people are scared of you or think you're against them, or if you are against racial injustice, then you're, you know, and you challenge them. So I think that there are always consequences, as again, John Lewis is a perfect example of doing that, but also is an example of why you should do it anyway. Okay, because it is, you know, if you be true to who God calls you to be. I mean, I believe in the resurrection. You know, I also know that Jesus did not die a natural death. Okay, he did only good. He loved, he told the truth, and he got killed. Not for doing bad, but for doing good. And so that's always the reality. I'm a follower of him, and as you know, trying to be a better one. So I think that's reality. And hopefully that's not Father Pat the priest simply. That's also Patrick the Christian. That's just being a disciple. That's what we're all called to. And to remember, if the world is filled with darkness, the problem is not the darkness, as bad as it is. Darkness, by definition, is the absence of something. It's the absence of light. Light should be shining somewhere, and it's not. So I think that, you know, so when I look at my vocation, who I am, I think that, you know, God continues to convict me to do what is right, and yes, but aware that sometimes there'll be a price to pay.
Mm-hmm. I'm now going to transition and taking questions and posing some of the questions that registrants put forward. The first one is, we've heard some verbal denouncing of racism from church leaders, but what can we do as a church to actually combat this sin? And also there was someone who wrote just this morning that said, Representative John Lewis, of course, he has now left us. He leaves us with this call to get into good trouble. What are the marching orders that people watching this should be taking? And anyone can take that question, or I can direct it to someone if no one pipes up.
I'll say get out and vote. What's the day? November 3rd? Is it November 3rd? November 6th. Vote, and we have to get out and register people to vote. I know it's kind of hard, but this is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. Each one register 10 people, please, and get them to the polls on election day.
I echo what Dina just said in regards to also voting. You know, we are called not to do the easy thing, but to do the right thing. And the right thing in this moment is to help galvanize our people, march and join with those that are out there doing the work, but also educate our own communities, because we may not, and people that may be on here listening may not be from a Black Catholic community or even a Black community, but looking at where there are injustices in your own environment and see how you can address those. Because as we talked about, it all begins of taking care of our own home before we can go out and help others. So see inside of ourselves and inside of our own community what needs to be addressed, and then working on helping the other community, wider community, make that change.
And for me, I want to approach it two ways. The marching orders internally for the church, I think this is a good time for churches to strengthen their social justice ministry, but not just with action. The best kind of action is what we call informed action. So I think people really need to study the history of St. Augustine's and the legacies of the power and the good work that St. Augustine has done. So you understand that there's joy, there's happiness and celebration doing what's right and what's just internally. Then externally, I encourage people to get involved with their local groups, like in DC, One DC, which I'm a part of, Empower DC. And then there's some national things that folks could do. You can get involved with the Rising Majority, which is the base building group of the Movement for Black Lives. You can get involved with the Right to the City, that is the largest group in the country that's trying to stop displacements in counties and cities throughout the United States among Black, brown, and immigrant people. So those are the type of marching orders that I think are really concrete and people can get engaged with.
I think I would add.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
And maybe more with the church, just some basic things with the church. You know, the civil rights movement, it really simply summed up, it was about having a seat and having a say. You know, so the images of having a seat at the lunch counter, and of course the right to vote. And I really think that in the church, I mean, one of the things that Dr. Ansel mentioned, Sister Thea Bowman's powerful address to the bishops, which you can still go to YouTube and see. One of the things she said, you know, oftentimes there are meetings and there are plans and things are made that affect our community for decades, and we're not there at the table. So just as far as that, so if if you're not there, you can't impact, you know. But part of calling up, you know, so church leaders to our church to first of all look at who are your key advisors, you know, who are the key that you put around you, you know. And for a long time, you know, the problem is we just were not represented, and in many cases today we're not. And so I think insisting on, so would that be lay advisory boards, but also clergy advisory boards that don't make decisions that impact the community when the people in that community are not there to have a say. So you can tell you, so I think that's one practical thing. But to look at things like, you know, I was in seminary 35 years ago, and I was the only Black African American at that particular seminary, you know, and I think that I believe today it looks very much the same. You know, there may be one, maybe two, but not many. Why 35 years later, as far as why are vocations, you know, why are we no more successful than now than we were back then? So I think, yeah, and this the other thing, just to comment about just stressing the importance of, you know, how we have to really rescue ourselves from this historical amnesia. You know, just as a very practical example, when, you know, back in the time of Reconstruction, the 12 years after slavery ended, you know that 80% of freed slaves in the South registered to vote. 80% of those slaves registered to vote. And by 1867, 2 years after, 80% were registered to vote. And, you know, a year later, the presidential election that took place of Ulysses Grant, he won by a small margin, 300 votes. Guess how many Black people voted? 500. 300,000, 500,000. So literally, had they not voted, that president would not have been elected. So that was true in 1868, and it's true in 2020 as well. So I think that, and again, part of you know, in that time too, when they had the right to vote and received citizenship, you know, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment, you know, they could, what kind of things they did, you know, they rebuilt, you know, shattered state schools, hospitals, orphanages, railroads. They were South Carolina. At one point, I think the legislature in South Carolina was like was a majority Black. And again, this is again before Jim Crow.
Right.
And again, when I talk about systemic, Jim Crow was not accidental. It was well thought out. It was planned, and that's probably the fourth. I mentioned police, courts, business, but also again, the political body that you have. Once former plantation owners were elected and put into office, they shut down Reconstruction. It was all shut down. Jim Crow, no vote, no right to citizenship, mass incarceration because of an election and several elections.
That's such, oh, go ahead. Someone else, I think was, that to me is such rich history, and it's so needed history, because I think so many people don't understand where our first Black senators, how that happened. With that in mind, there's another question about the lie of history. This person wants to know, what should the church do about the lie that is white images in our churches and schools? Anyone can take that.
I would echo what Father Pat just said. We have to learn our history. And in doing so, specifically in the church, and God bless, the work I'm hearing that St. Augustine has done, and I hope to learn more as I get accustomed here to DC. But knowing who we are and whose we are, as we say in the church, and that's learning our Black Catholic history. And so for us, looking at the books, like I said, one by Cyprian Davis, The History of Black Catholics in the United States, and also more recently that's come out is the African American Catholic Youth Bible, which also has history stuff in there about our lineage and everything like that. And also looking at church documents such as What We Have Seen and Heard and Brothers and Sisters to Us, which is all written about our journey and where we are and why we are where we're at. And so that when we look at policies that come out or certain statements that come out, we can challenge with our true truth, as Sister Thea used to say, so that when we're out there, we're passing on this knowledge, because what we're seeing is with this generation gap that's happening in our Black Catholic community, but specifically in our Black Catholic community, our history is not being passed down. And it's unique that we have churches such as my church, St. Peter Claver back home, or St. Augustine here in Washington, DC, where we have that history lived out in our liturgical experience. So we have to understand why we do what we do and pass that on to the next generation.
Mm-hmm. There's a question coming in from a teenager who I'm going to jump to the front of the line, which is, what can teenagers do to help the Black community flourish? We want to help. That's from a teenager. Anyone can jump in.
I'll be really quick. There's a nationwide youth group and youth movement called BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100. And there is a chapter in DC. So that's one thing young people can do. Then there's another nationwide group that deals with youth and environmental justice. Like, a lot of our health and land issues are related to not respecting Mother Earth and destroying the earth. And that group is called the Sunrise Movement. So I would encourage young people to get involved with those groups, or there's space for you to be creative and start your own little group, right?
Yes. And I wanted to tag on to Dominic. Dominic invoked throughout this some of our other cloud of witnesses. So it's incumbent upon us to know our young people. They want to know us. We need to get out and reach them. Dr. Augustine does this work. We knew a Loza York or Pauline Jones or Ernest Withers who said, come here, you will do this. Come here, I'm going to tell you something. So we need to reach out and learn the young people. And look how they have changed this whole trajectory in the country. What they did with the formation of SNCC, they changed the whole course of the civil rights movement. What the Black Lives Matter has been able to do in this country, just look what they've done since George Floyd. We need to find our young people and bring them in and give them the marching orders like people like Dominic and I got when we were much younger people.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that by saying to the young person that wrote that, I'm sure if you're on the webinar, you probably already show up to church, but to our other young people and probably to your peers, show up, let the church know you're there. and also to our adults, that's on the flip side. As a youth worker, I was talking with someone last night dealing with the issue with their youth group. 90% of our problems as youth workers are not the kids, it's usually the adults. So for those of us in the church, being advocates so these young people can speak their truth to our church, and we create an opportunity for them to be listened to and heard. So that's my challenge.
Mm-hmm. Another one I'm going to read now is, how can I best advocate for racial equality as a white citizen of America? I feel like I try and live my life as an example of fairness. I am very vocal in my own personal conversations in social media space, but that is just not enough. I've heard that question from a lot of white people. I should say that some African Americans that I've talked to feel very burdened by that question because they think that white people should be educating themselves on what to do. But I want to put the question to the group in case anybody wants to answer.
Yeah, I can start. There is a way for millions of white people to not burden Black folks or brown folks or immigrant folks with this racial justice question, and that is by getting involved with a group that's called SURGE. SURGE stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. It's all white-led. They do political education. They do anti-racist training. And so that's where a lot of people should go. In the DC and Baltimore area, they have pretty good, strong chapters of SURGE. So it's showing up for racial justice.
I'm going to also now go to this person who says, my ancestors were enslaved and were owned by Jesuit priests. How will the Catholic Church reconcile its sordid involvement in the institution of slavery with an anti-racist and social justice message?
That's a lot of work that needs to be done.
That's a big question.
Yeah, it's the true truth. It's almost like that magic bullet question. How can we get parents more involved in church and all these other things, and how can we save the youth and create those things? But I think for us is one, for the church to continue to acknowledge, and we're in this moment with this Black Lives Matter movement, post George Floyd murder movement, where institutions are seeing that the way things have normally been done cannot work anymore. This next generation that's coming up are not tolerating that. And I think for the church, for us to look at that, as you said, that sordid history, and see how we can, as we have the sacrament of reconciliation, be reconciled, to our past sins, and also create that opportunity to create justice. We have the Catholic social teaching, those teachings out there that talk about social justice, dignity of the human person, different things that are there, and also look at what we focus on as right to life issues. In the Black community, for me, in New Orleans is #1 in the world for mass incarceration, the for-profit prison industry. And who do you think they're locking up? I have to look at my young people as survival as a youth minister, not just teaching them about the faith, but helping them survive daily in the reality that was New Orleans when I was the youth minister. And, for us, that is our right to life issue, along with racism, along with all these other things that tie into Catholic social teaching. So for us, looking at what is important and what is right, because we do what we do, not because people are Catholic, we do what we do because we're Catholic, and that's how we live out our faith.
I want to build on the word that Dr. Augustine used, and that is reconciliation.
Mhm.
I think it would be very courageous in this moment for the church to do what was somewhat successful in South Africa. It could have been more successful, and that is create a truth and reconciliation committee. But that committee really should be focusing on reparations, but once again, systemic and structural reparations. So I'm not focusing on individuals, right, but on institutions, like around the whole public health issues with all these Catholic hospitals becoming more accessible, with free education at Catholic institutions. There's really ways where reparations can really deal with the damage that was done. And then there could be a reconciliation and a repairing of our relationships with each other.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read this question is a little long, but I think it's important. I feel that the USCCB has fully chosen to align themselves with the Republican Party. When the church is on the same side as the Republican Party on issues such as pro-life, the church is very vocal. However, when they are not on the same side as the Republican Party, such as on immigration and the support of those in low income status, the church is very silent and they try their best to not bring attention to themselves. As an example, the church is very vocal on the opposition to the Obamacare contraceptive mandate. I understand that, but how the church has articulated their stance gives the impression that they are against everyone having health care. If I'm not mistaken, I think that is not true. However, since they are silent when they disagree with the Republican Party, silence becomes constant. Is the church afraid? This definitely shows up in racism and specifically the anti-Black stance of many white Republicans. It really has made me suspicious of white priests and white bishops. Father Pat, I'll put that question to you, given that they're talking about the alignment of the church, and I'm sure you're eager to answer that question.
Well, I think that it's a fair question. It is a very fair question. I think, we talked about leadership and it takes courage. And I think that when your business for existing is evangelizing, is sharing a message, about Christ and his gospel, that it's no small thing if the perception you're giving is that, in fact, that I'm aligned with a political party, or, that you can have legitimate beefs with any piece of legislation, even Obamacare, but you don't have, but without saying, and this is what's good about it. And this is what, yes. And so a lot of times leadership, for example, in the 80s, the bishops of the United States were talked often about healthcare, not as a privilege, but a right, universal healthcare. But you have different bishops now. And so, so I think a lot of times it's almost like in the political world, you have elections, you new people in office and in power, and they go in very different directions. So I think that you're right, but the person who asked the question rightfully calling out our leaders to courage and being true to the gospel. When you look at the social teaching of the church, the Catholic social teaching, it talks about healthcare as a right. It talks about the rights of workers, to organize and labor unions, be part of labor unions, all those things that were heavily promoted and by even our leaders. But the laborers were maybe Italian immigrants or Irish immigrants and others. The point is that the principles still, but now the immigrants don't look like that anymore. They are brown, they are Black, they're not from Italy, they're from Mexico. So the point, but the principle still, so I think those are all fair criticisms. And but again, you got to make distinction between, first of all, as Dr. Ansel said, got to be educated for Catholic social teaching, as well as just the history of the church and the history of racism in our society. I think that's, and I think that's also my answer too, also for white folks who say, what else can I do? Again, I think that this historical amnesia, my experience is when encountering, often discussing issues with white men and women, often have this defensiveness and almost like, well, maybe it's not that, or how do you know it's racism? How do you know it's kind of like, and they are completely ignorant of the history, so they bought the line of Black criminality, which is total propaganda. Okay, there's no, it's like, Blacks were massively arrested after slavery, not because they were criminals, because people wanted the slave industry to keep going. Okay, so Blacks have a good reason for not having trust historically, because because of how the institution of law enforcement was actually complicit with the same institution of slavery and Jim Crow, and they were enforcing it. And so to this day, there's suspicion. Literally, people like call the police for just to check on the neighbor. They might end up being killed because you did that. Okay, so I think that the point I was making earlier, just that I think that it's a legitimate criticism, and I think that, but that's what I said, know the teaching of the church, and also you can, because sometimes, quite frankly, there are some bishops, of the diocese who have been completely wrong in our line, who would literally tell people, don't vote for this one, vote for that one, who've just completely gotten it wrong. And the people who know their faith would know it instantly that they're preaching their opinion right now, okay, or they're partisan politics, but not the gospel of Jesus Christ. Important to make that
Anyone?
statement.
I want to go to the next question, which is, actually, this one that came in this morning, I'm going to read it from off my computer. It says, I attended a Catholic webinar recently. A question came up regarding Black Lives Matter. The answer included that no Catholic should support it. And I was referred to their website, which I was told would indicate elements that go against the faith. What is your opinion of Black Lives Matter and how it relates to the Catholic faith? Can Catholics support Black Lives Matter? Anyone can jump in. I'm kind of interested in maybe what Dr. Ansel has to say, because I think maybe this will be up your alley.
Okay, well, no problem. If it's a problem that the terminology Black Lives Matter is an issue, well, then we're missing the point of our Catholic faith. And I'm not talking about the organization, I'm talking about the movement, because this is what we're all called to be. Catechism, one of our basic church documents, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I believe it's paragraph 1934 and 1935, if I'm correct. It talks about any form of discrimination is indirect and is reprehensible to God. So basically, racism in and of itself is a sin. And we are all, in that same paragraph, it says we are all made in his image and likeness. And so when we look at Black Lives Matter, yes, back home when I was advocating, or even on a national level, when I advocate for our African-American, specifically Catholic youth ministries, you know, I have my youth ministry colleagues come back with the all lives matter statement and all the, well, Black lives aren't mattering right now, so we can focus on all lives. Let's focus on these lives, you know, and those challenges are always there to distract, to defer from the real issue at hand. So yes, that's what I've seen and heard in different webinars and different spaces when they go back to the organization. But I think what we as a church are focusing
Dr. Ansel,
on.
we lost you a little bit. I'm not sure why not. Why
Are
we
you
can't
here?
hear you?
Are you here right now? Am I back?
I hear you. I was not sure what she can.
Yeah,
Okay.
I hear you.
Oh,
Okay.
you can hear me? Okay, go ahead.
All right. I think for us is to remember that we're focusing on the movement for a better and more just society than we are on a specific organization.
I just like to echo that. Basically, this is a straw man, a fake issue to ignore the whole issue. Okay, that's my experience when that issue. Now, this is never, I mean, I gave a sermon once on just talking about, can the lives of Black people matter? And at one point I said that Black lives matter. And there were many people just, you know, that the sermon would not be published. It was simply basically suppressed because they said my sermon, you know, would be, you know, promoting abortion. And it's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, we found it one, you know, a group, and that, you know, that Black Lives Matter, and that there's some people who, it's like, that's the issue. Again, we as Catholics, many of us marched, you know, a few months ago. And again, the reality is that there is a critical issue of systemic racism historically. The lives of Black people do not matter like the lives of white people. There is demonstrable evidence on every level. And so the idea is, so if you want to simply, what I find most times people say, you know, we are not ever going to join a particular organization. It's like, but, you know, well, people of different backgrounds, different organizations, maybe different beliefs, standing together to say, no, what we saw happen to George Floyd is not just about George Floyd. And that we have to say enough is enough. And so I think that, you know, what I find many times when people say, you know, that they reduce the principle to a particular organization is just a reason to dismiss the whole discussion. Which I think
we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna ask a couple more questions. The first is Senator Tom Cotton introduced legislation that would prohibit public schools from using federal funds to teach the 1619 Project, of course, the critical journalism initiative produced by the New York Times exploring the history of slavery in America. What are your thoughts? And I want to go to you, Dina.
You know, we've seen across the country recently. Is he from Texas? Arkansas. And particularly across it, where they have just totally rewritten the history of Native people, of Black people, of Mexican Americans, and it's scary. It is scary, and that's where we need to have good trouble. This is when we need to be good trouble to stop that type of stuff going on. Texas, their history books have been absolutely whitewashed. I know I've read a lot about what Texas has, so that's what we need to be good trouble. And can you send us some information off of that, because we need to start a movement against that. That's crazy to take money out to tell your, they want to tell their story.
Mhm. I want to go to this question. Says, I'm saddened that many parishes I attend where parishioners are predominantly white pray for law enforcement officers. They should do so. However, the prayers often leave me feeling like it's a dog whistle to their stance on Black Lives Matter. What is the church's stance on Black Lives Matter? How is that stance translated into practical day-to-day actions that the church is committed to doing and promoting? Father Pat, is there an official stance the church has taken on Black Lives Matter and the movement?
Again, I think if you go, there've been several statements that have been put out against, against racism, specifically about police brutality with George Floyd. I believe, I don't know if there was a statement about Breonna Taylor, but there have been several statements over the past even just 4 months. But again, there's been no, I think really it's so important that it's not just about, when people talk about, I think I say the straw man, typically Black Lives Matter, Inc. That's not, if you look around the country, it's not about let's support an organization. It's support a movement, okay? And the movement is, and I think that, I think as Dr. Ansel said, that the church is with it. And he mentioned one of the documents, the universal key document, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, is the official teaching that, so as far as it comes to how we treat, the disenfranchised, those who are oppressed, the position of the church is that we be a voice and stand up for those. So whether it is in January marching for the lives of the unborn, and by the way, when someone says unborn lives matter, nobody screams and says, no, my life matters too. All lives matter. When any group is saying, screaming, my life matters, it's because they are not being heard and they are hurting, and we should listen. Why are they screaming? Why is this group saying my life matters? When you believe all lives matter, then why are they screaming? Because they're not being included. So I think that, again, the church's teaching is very clear as far as, and I'll call, as far as, speaking up for the poor, for those who are disenfranchised, and so speaking up for the lives of Black people, who are being murdered and disenfranchised on so many different levels, is perfectly appropriate and not inappropriate, but really our mission.
I want to go to the next question, which is, I'm concerned about the negative Catholic press that disparages Archbishop Gregory, who allowed his voice to be heard regarding the institutional racism in this country and his critique of President Trump, who wanted to have a photo op in front of the shrine. Do you share my concerns? Anyone can jump in.
I guess not to go into too much business of that issue. I guess that morning I was going to Anacostia, where I was using the office space for the internet. And when I opened up my laptop, I had all these voicemails from different people from around the country. I didn't even know what my office line was, because I haven't even been in my office space yet due to the pandemic and moving here. And people were concerned about the visit and certain things like that from the president to the JP2 shrine. And then a couple of hours later, when Archbishop Gregory wrote his statement, there were more voicemails from people on the other side of the fence of how could he say this and how could this, how could that. I think for us, we have to remember the unique position that it is to be a Black man in America, whether ordained or unordained. And for us to step up and support as we need to, because when we are courageous, to do, like I said, not the easy thing, but the right thing, we will be attacked. And so my stance on it, of course, I'm going to support our Archbishop, not only because he's my boss and my supervisor, but it's the right thing to do. And he did the right thing, not the easy thing. And for us to step out as best as we can, for those that are willing to be educated on the real reasons these issues are the issues that they are. And so, and that's the just work that we're called to do. Jesus didn't, as Father Pat said so eloquently, Jesus didn't get crucified for making people mad for doing the easy thing. He got crucified for making people and the institution upset for doing the right thing. And that's what we're called to do as people of faith.
I want to move to this question. We have only a couple minutes left. what role does Catholic institutions of higher education, what role should they play in confronting systemic racism that goes beyond simply promoting diversity and inclusion on their campuses? What role has tokenism played in these efforts? And someone also this morning put out a question, which is, why are there not more Black universities around the country?
Black Catholic universities.
Yes.
I guess I'll just touch on what I believe could be well, Black Catholic universities, I think it's because of numbers and resources that are there. Thank God, first of all, I'm a proud Xavier grad, XU. And I think for me, we just received a $20 million grant, anonymous donor, largest donation in the history of the school. Now, but when you look at the history of some of our HBCUs, there's a struggle going on to maintain that work. Xavier being #1 in the country for sending African Americans to medical school, it's in a unique place and a unique support system that's there. But it's also trying to maintain that Catholic identity that's a challenge. When I was campus minister there, and still the work that I do whenever I'm there on campus is to help create and foster that opportunity, because many of the students there are not Catholic, but helping them to understand why this institution is the way it is, and not to necessarily convert anybody, but to help them understand the universal love that the Catholic Church is supposed to profess. In regards to the issue of places of higher learning, we saw a couple of years ago all these Black Lives Matter protests and movements throughout these universities. And these are now the graduates that I believe, if I would assume, are leading a lot of these movements in their communities. And so what these places of higher education need to understand, whether they're HBCU or not, is how to educate the whole person, not just for the major or minor that they're studying, but to help them understand the ills of society. And especially in our Catholic universities that are doing it right, is to how to help educate the person to be a better person for society. So I think when they do that, that's when we take this to heart.
And the last question, go ahead. Actually, Dina, I was gonna go to you, so go ahead.
See, the donation came from Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. I can't recall her name now. She also gave $40 million to Howard University.
Okay.
That's the source of the donation. Mm-hmm.
And I was going to come to you, Dina, last, because I think you've been so good at grounding us in the fact that St. Augustine in particular has always known the way to be on the right side of history and the way to organize and to have real change. So I would just leave it with you to say, is there anything else that you think people should be thinking about as we move forward and people think about, okay, I watched this, what else can we do?
I guess keep the faith, keep praying, and keep getting into good trouble. We will get to the other side.
That's a good way to end this. Thank you so much, Dina, Father Pat, Dr. Ansel, Dominic. This has been a great conversation. I think there's been a robust sense of all the things that we have to do to moving forward, but also the history of the Catholic Church and the way that we reconcile. And now I think, yes, Dr. Father Pat?
Can I just add, I'm sorry, the battery went out and I just dropped off. But just one word of hope, and it may have been said, that, one, we also inviting our leaders like our bishop. We've been blessed. We have this time with Archbishop Gregory, who's been very open, ready to listen. He's done even a bus tour of the city of the unbeaten path, listening to a lot of our local leaders. He appointed a new chaplain to Howard University, which is long overdue. Historically Black University, Father Robert Boxey, who's an African-American priest, who's a full-time chaplain now at Howard University. He's again brought in Dr. Ansel to lead the Office of Cultural Diversity. So I think there are, again, many signs of hope and encouragement. I think we have a listening ear in our leadership in Washington.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Well, that is a great way to end, Father Pat. Thanks so much for offering that and for sharing that information. Now, Marlisha is going to join us back. Marlisha, take it away.
Thank you so much, Yamiche. Thank you to all of our esteemed panelists this morning. This was an excellent discussion, and I hope that our attendees, our parishioners, and those watching on YouTube around the country, around the world, will find this discussion to be really enlightening and motivating in our individual efforts as the laity to tackle systemic racism in our country, in our society, and in our church. I want to advise that this is the first of a two-part series. We expect to have a second panel in a couple of weeks, so please stay tuned to our website, Saint, S-A-I-N-T, Augustine-DC.org, or our social media platforms on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where we will have additional information. We will also have resources that were mentioned today, as well as other resources that were compiled before this webinar available on our website for more information. Thank you so much for parishioners and others interested. Please also check and read your flock notes, your weekly flock notes for additional information and updates. Thank you so much, Yamiche, and thank you to everyone. Be blessed and have a great day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Thanks.